Good morning, Period 1, and we're back with another broadcast of BR News. It is Monday, June 6th. Today we'll be talking to Fulgencio Batista, Fidel and Raul Castro, and special guest President John Kennedy about the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution occurred in the 1950s and aimed to overthrow the government of the dictator Fulgencio Batista. The leader of the movement was Fidel Castro. Brothers Fidel and Raul Castro were captured and sentenced to prison for 15 years, but Batista released them after 11 months. President John F. Kennedy attempted to overthrow Castro's government in 1961. Corrupt dictatorship led by Batista and economic dependence on the United States were the causes of the revolution. The revolution led Cuba to become a communist state. The declining economic conditions in Cuba and improvement to healthcare and education. Traveling all the way to Cuba, we have Kennedy Farrell interviewing Batista.
I'm Kennedy Farrell, and joining me is Fulgencio Batista. Tell me about your early life.
I grew up as the son of impoverished farmers. I worked a lot of other jobs before joining the Army when I turned 20 years old in 1921. My first job in the Army was a stenographer, or a court reporter. I eventually rose to the rank of sergeant and gained a lot of followers.
How did you come to power?
After I managed to gain a lot of followers, I decided to lead a revolt. It was known as the Revolt of the Sergeant. We overthrew the liberal government of Gerardo Macchiato. I appointed myself as the chief of military, and after I spoke to the U.S. and they told me they were not getting involved, I decided to become the ruler myself. I forced the president, Ramon Grau San Martin, to resign, and I appointed Carlos Mendieta as president.
What type of rule did you enforce over the Cuban people?
Instead of being a harsh and cruel leader, I decided to control through patronage. I used men as puppet presidents, never being president myself. However, when I finally became president the first time in 1940, I got support from the Army, the civil service, and organized labor. Not only did I greatly enrich myself, I also expanded the educational system, sponsored a huge program of public works, and I fostered the growth of the economy. However, many of Fidel Castro's followers claim that I was too dictatorial and indifferent to popular concerns throughout my second time. Just because I used open displays of brutality to maintain control during my second term does not make me a bad ruler.
Tell me a little bit about how your rule came to an end.
My rule came to an end because of Fidel Castro. Castro's rebel forces launched an attack beginning in 1953 and finally kicked me out of power in 1959. This attack is often known as the Cuban Revolution. The claim for the attack was that I was a corrupt ruler and I shouldn't be trusted because I switched to an anti-communism government to gain support from the U.S.
Thank you, Batista. Now back to G in the studio.
Thanks, Kennedy. And now we go to Jeanette with Fidel Castro.
Thanks, G. I'm Jeanette, coming live to you from Cuba. I'm here with Fidel Castro. Let's get started. What did you do before you became the dictator of Cuba?
Before I took control as the dictator of my home country, Cuba, I was in the military. I served as Commander-in-Chief of Cuba's Armed Forces in 1995 to 2008. I also served First Secretary of Communist Party of Cuba until 2001. I also participated in the non-aligned movement internationally twice between the years of 1979 and 2008. This all led up to me overthrowing Batista's military dictatorship.
What kinds or types of uprisings did you start?
I participated in rebellions against right-wing governments in the Dominican and Colombia. Afterwards, I planned to overthrow Batista, who was at the time the Cuban president. Later, I served a year in prison after a failed attack on the Moncada barracks. I also formed a revolutionary group with my brother called the 26th of July Movement. I led the Cuban Revolution, which outlasted Batista and brought me into power in Cuba as a dictator.
How did you rule?
Under my rule, Cuba became a one-party socialist state. I also made their industry and business nationalized. Social reforms were implemented in all areas of society. I also expanded healthcare and education, accompanied by state control of the press and suspension of internal dissent.
What was your family life like?
Well, Jeanette, being the son of an illegitimate wealthy farmer, I ended up adopting leftist, anti-imperialist policies. I also have a sister and a brother. My sister, unfortunately, has turned against me and my policies and lives in the United States. She continues to harshly speak out against me despite my efforts to be civil with her. But my loyal brother, Raul, was an amazing little brother, to the point where after I finished my rule in Cuba, I handed him down my power.
Why did your regime end?
During my regime in Cuba, I was successful in reducing illiteracy, stamping out racism, and improving health care for the public. During my rule, I was widely criticized for stifling economic and political freedom. I also, unfortunately, was the cause for Cuba having current bad relations with the U.S. My supporters viewed me as a dictator who was abused by his critics. My regime ended when I handed down my power to my younger brother, Raul.
Now back to G in the studio.
Thanks, Jeanette. And now we go to Allie, who's interviewing Raul Castro.
Thanks, G. I'm now here with Raul Castro. So, Raul, can you tell me some background about yourself?
I was born on June 3rd, 1931 in Byron, Cuba. I have 11 other siblings, and I never really did well in school, but immediately I joined a social group when I could. I was also a rebel commander of army before I came to office.
When I browsed the internet, I discovered that your government never became part democratic, even though most of the Cuban civilians called for it. Why is that?
Cuba's elections are known as party-led democracies. This basically means that the population votes for the candidate, but the candidate can be a part of any party. For example, my brother and I have led dictatorships. Although we have dictatorships, the citizens still have many rights. Our dictatorship prevents us from being overthrown by the people.
So, how did you become president?
My brother Fidel came to power in 1959 and ruled for 49 years until 2008. He would have continued ruling until his death, but he became too ill to rule any longer. So then I stepped in and succeeded him as leader.
Now, I must ask you an important question. Will your children succeed you in office?
If later on they decide to run for office, they can, but currently there are already a couple of expected candidates. Even my brother Fidel, who is now good and healthy, wants to run again and be in office until his death.
Do you plan to be in office until your death?
No, my plan is different from Fidel's. My plan is to stay in charge for the second term in 2008, then I will retire from being head of state. But I'm not sure whether I will retire as head of PPC, but if I do retire in both occupations, I will be moving to Mexico.
What was an improvement you made in Cuba that you were most proud of?
I am proud to say that I have restored ties with the U.S. after they had been broken because of the Cuban Missile Crisis between the U.S. and Cuba.
Thanks, Raul. Now back to G in the studio.
And now we travel to the United States, where Johan is interviewing John F. Kennedy.
Here I am with John F. Kennedy. How did you feel about Fidel Castro?
The U.S. government distrusted Castro and was very weary of his relationship with the leader of the Soviet Union.
How did you come up with the plan to invade?
I was told by the CIA that we were going to train Cuban exiles for an invasion of their homeland.
What was the goal of the invasion?
The ultimate goal was to overthrow Castro and the establishment of a non-communist government friendly to the United States.
What was the result of the Bay of Pigs?
The Cuban government won, but I was determined to make up for the failed invasion, so the U.S. came up with a plan to sabotage and destabilize the Cuban government and economy.
How did the U.S. and Cuba's friendly relationship change?
The government in Washington lacked the imagination and compassion to understand the needs of people in Cuba. They also lacked the leadership to move forward to meet these needs.
Was there any one thing you did to make the Cubans mad at you?
We refused to help Cuba meet its desperate needs for economic progress. Since only 1/3 of the homes on the island had running water, they were very angered by this.
Thanks, Mr. Kennedy. Now back to Allie in the west wing of the studio.
Wow, those were some pretty great rulers. Now before we go, I want to touch up on modern day Cuba. Today in the capital of Cuba, Havana, it's feeling kind of cold. Some would even say it's like an ice Cuba. That pun was funny on astronomical levels. This just in, we have a Cuban in our audience. Come on down. Hope you all were Havana good time. This is Ali Chung signing off. See you next time, VR.